Did you compliment each other?
Once,
One
John
time?
gave me a compliment.
In how many years?
Once? Lord! No, I think it's Revolver. But it was Here, There and Everywhere was one of my songs on it. And but John sort of, just when it finishes, that's a really good song, that. I love that song. And I was like, yes, he likes it. You know, I've remembered it to this day. It's pathetic, really.
After the Beatles' breakup, Paul McCartney finally spoke up about John Lennon. The two of them had written some of the greatest songs the world has ever known, the partnership behind more than 600 million records sold. And yet, by the end, they could barely stand to be in the same room. They sued each other. They traded insults in the press. John even tore Paul apart in a song, telling the world he was washed up and finished. So what really happened between them after the music stopped? And where did they stand on the terrible night John was murdered in 1980? The truth is far more heartbreaking and far more tender than the feud everyone remembers.
How often do you think about John? How often does it come across
Quite
your
often,
mind?
yeah. Quite often, yeah. I dream about him.
Oh, really? Would you mind sharing one?
No.
The cracks begin to show. The trouble that would eventually break the Beatles apart started long before the official split. It began in earnest during the making of the sprawling record fans now called the White Album. By then, John and Paul had largely stopped writing together in the same room, working on their songs separately, even though every credit still read Lennon and McCartney. For a while, Paul tried hard to keep the peace. Eventually, though, he cracked. A member of the studio staff later recalled hearing the two of them screaming at each other in the hallway and described the sound as genuinely frightening, with Paul accusing John of being reckless, childish, and determined to sabotage the band. At the center of the storm was one person, Yoko Ono. John had begun bringing her into the studio and keeping her at his side while the group worked, something no Beatle had ever done before, and Paul and the others felt it was quietly pulling the band apart. But John would not budge. To him, the matter was simple and final. He loved Yoko, and he was not about to let his bandmates push her out. He felt they had never given her a fair chance, and he never forgot what he saw as the cruel way she had been treated, including moments when he believed George had insulted her to her face. In interviews after the split, John refused to apologize for any of it. "It's too late for me," he said flatly. "I'm for Yoko." He demanded to know why she should have to absorb that kind of treatment from the people around him. Sitting through endless recording sessions with what he bitterly called some of the most big-headed, uptight people on earth had become unbearable to him, and being insulted merely for loving someone was more than he was willing to take. He drew a line, and he never really stepped back from it. Years later, John admitted he could not forgive the others for how they had made Yoko feel. And then, almost in the same breath, he confessed that he could not stop loving them either. That single contradiction, unforgiving, and yet still loving, would come to define the entire feud that followed. The war on vinyl.
We're talking about the business of the Beatles, and this to me is fascinating. When they break up, all right? And who knows who broke, everyone has a theory.
I know.
Who broke it up?
John.
John did.
Yeah.
When the lawyers moved in and the band officially came apart, the two men took their war out of the studio and pressed it straight onto their records. In 1971, John released his album, Imagine. Alongside its gorgeous, hopeful title track sat one of the most vicious songs he ever wrote, a direct attack on Paul called How Do You Sleep? In it, John sneered at Paul's music, waved away his masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper, and suggested that without the Beatles, Paul was finished, a spent talent with nothing left to offer. To twist the knife further, George Harrison played a biting slide guitar solo on the track, a public signal of exactly whose side he was on. The song stunned longtime fans and remains, for many, the ugliest single moment of the entire breakup. Even Ringo Starr, who was in the room during the sessions, is said to have finally spoken up and told John that he had gone far enough. John himself would later regret the sheer cruelty of it, while still stubbornly insisting the song was a fine piece of music underneath all the venom. Paul, for his part, was not entirely innocent either. On his own solo record that same year, he had already slipped a few quiet jabs at John and Yoko into one of his songs, needling John for what he saw as his constant preaching, and accusing him of taking a lucky break and snapping it in two. What stung Paul even more, though, was a claim making the rounds at the time, that his entire contribution to the Beatles amounted to little more than booking the studio and writing one song, Yesterday. He knew that was absurd, and hearing it echoed in John's attack, that all he had ever really done was Yesterday cut deep. But the worst discovery came later, when Paul learned just how personal the whole thing had been. He came to believe that the band's manager at the time had actually sat with John, feeding him cruel lines, encouraging a deliberate campaign to humiliate Paul in song. The whole poisonous mood, as Paul once described it, could be boiled down to a single chilling idea. Let us get Paul. Let us nail him. A wound deeper than music. To understand why the feud cut so deep, you have to look past the music and into the wound beneath it. There is a haunting detail that binds John and Paul together. Both of them lost their mothers while they were still teenagers, John at 17 when his mother Julia was killed, and Paul at 14 when his mother Mary died of cancer. It was in the raw aftermath of that shared grief that the two boys found each other and began building the partnership that would change the world. So when the Beatles fell apart, and each man turned instead to his wife, John to Yoko and Paul to Linda, they were not simply losing a writing partner. They were losing the one person who had helped them survive the deepest loss of their young lives. Losing that original bond, the one forged in mourning, may have been far more traumatic for both of them than either man ever fully understood. They had even grieved differently, and always had. John was raised by his Aunt Mimi and wore his emotions right on the surface, raw and loud. Paul was raised by his father and learned instead to keep his feelings locked away. He once described the night his family learned his mother had died, how everyone kept a stiff upper lip until he heard his father, a man who never cried, weeping quietly in the next room. It was, Paul said, a private kind of grief, and it was the very same grief that had once drawn him and John together. It is one of the quiet tragedies of their whole story. Two grieving boys who found in each other the understanding no one else could give them, and who then, as grown men, tore it to pieces in front of the entire world. You can only wound someone that badly if they once meant everything to you. But this is not, in the end, a story about how two brothers destroyed each other. It is a story about how they slowly found their way back. Because what would happen a few years later in a New York apartment on one perfectly ordinary Saturday night would become the most extraordinary near miss in the history of music. First, though, the ice had to break. The first thaw. For years it looked as though the damage might be permanent. Then, slowly, the ice began to melt. The turning point came in 1974, during a strange and turbulent stretch of John's life that he himself nicknamed his Lost Weekend. He had separated from Yoko and moved out to Los Angeles, drinking hard and drifting. One night, while John was working in a studio with the singer Harry Nilsson, Paul and Linda happened to drop by, and something remarkable took place. The two old partners picked up their instruments and played together. It was the first time in years the two of them had been in the same room without lawyers, anger, or old grievances hanging in the air between them. That loose, ragged jam, which also pulled in the likes of Stevie Wonder, turned out to be the only known occasion the two of them ever made music together again after the Beatles, and a rough recording of it later circulated among collectors under the fitting title A Toot and a Snore in '74. It was not a great performance, but it was them, in a room, playing, and that was the entire point. Around this same time, John's girlfriend May Pang quietly took what would become the very last known photograph of John Lennon and Paul McCartney together. The bitterness that had once seemed so bottomless was finally, gently, beginning to lift. They were slowly becoming something they had not been in years, not partners, not rivals, but simply two old friends who had known each other since they were boys. It did not happen all at once. Over the next 2 years, the two men slowly circled back toward one another, spending time together in both Los Angeles and New York. At one point, John was even said to be considering flying out to record with Paul again, an idea that would have been unthinkable at the height of the feud. The old wounds were far from forgotten, but they were no longer the whole story. Little by little, the friendship was quietly outlasting the anger that had tried to bury it. The last time they ever met, by the spring of 1976, John was back with Yoko and living at the Dakota, their famous apartment building in New York, raising their baby son, Sean. On the evening of April the 24th, Paul and Linda came by to visit, and the two couples settled in front of the television. What happened next has become one of the most beloved near misses in all of music history. They tuned in to the young comedy show Saturday Night Live, and its producer, Lorne Michaels, looked into the camera and made a now legendary joke offer, $3,000 for the Beatles to reunite live on his program. What Michaels had no idea about was that two of them were watching from just across town. John turned to Paul and said they should head down to the studio themselves, just the two of them, and split the money. For a moment, they genuinely considered it. They almost called for a cab. In the end, they were simply too tired, and chose to enjoy their night off instead. It was a warm, funny, wonderfully ordinary evening between old friends, and it was the last time John Lennon and Paul McCartney would ever see each other in person. Neither man had any way of knowing that. Their reunions in these years were not always so smooth. John later admitted that Paul had a habit of simply turning up at the Dakota unannounced with his guitar, until John finally had to ask him, only half joking, to please call ahead first, because it was not 1956 anymore. It stung Paul at the time, but underneath the friction was something tender, the sense of two grown men trying, imperfectly, to find their way back to each other. Over the following year or so, they kept the thread alive the only way they now could, through the occasional phone call, talking not about music or business, but about the small domestic details of their lives, their children, their homes, the quiet ordinariness of growing older. Two guys talking about bread. Of all the conversations those two extraordinary men could have shared near the end, the one Paul treasures most was almost comically ordinary. Their final phone calls were not about legendary songs or unfinished business. One of them, famously, was about baking bread. Paul has recalled the sheer relief of it. Two of the most famous people alive, talking about whether you leave the dough to rise overnight, with no tension, no threat, no old wounds reopening, just two guys chatting. He has said he would not change a single thing about that conversation. It was not some grand, revealing summit about their decades together. It was better than that. It was easy. It was the sound of the friendship they had shared as teenagers, finally restored after all the years of anger. They had once lived in each other's pockets, utterly inseparable, and by the end, they had found their way back to exactly that. For Paul, knowing they had reached that place again would come to mean everything, because he had no idea just how little time was left. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that picture. These were two men who had reshaped modern music, who had stood together at the very center of the most famous band in history, and who had then screamed at each other, sued each other, and wounded each other in front of the entire world. And in the end, what they wanted from one another was not an apology or a reunion or a grand summing up of everything they had been. It was just this: the comfort of an ordinary chat between two old mates, the kind they used to have as boys in Liverpool, long before any of the fame arrived to complicate it all. Paul has said how glad he was that their very last conversations were the good kind, the warm kind, and not one of the bitter phone calls that had so often ended with a slammed receiver. The morning the music stopped. Then came the morning that shattered everything. On the 8th of December, 1980, a disturbed fan named Mark David Chapman, who had gotten John to sign an autograph for him only hours earlier, waited outside the Dakota and shot John Lennon dead as he came home. He was just 40 years old. For Paul, the news arrived by phone, early in the morning, and it was so horrific that his mind simply refused to accept it. He has spoken about how, for days afterward, he could not make himself believe that John was truly gone. He would only ever call it just a huge shock. The hardest part was the finality of it, the sudden, brutal certainty that he would never see John again, that the two of them would never again simply hang out. When reporters ambushed him outside a studio the very next day, a numb, hollow-eyed Paul could only mumble that it was a drag, a remark that struck some as coldly understated. In truth, it was the sound of a man in total shock, unable to find words for something far too large to hold. He has spoken since about how hard it was even to pass the news along to his own family, how he moved through those first days in a fog, unable to make himself accept that his oldest friend had been taken so suddenly and so violently. The man he had known since he was a teenager, the partner he had only just made peace with, was gone in an instant, and there would be no more phone calls, no more ordinary chats, no chance to say any of the things still left unsaid. On the subject of the man who killed his friend, Paul has never once softened. He has said that whether the act was pure evil or pure madness, it was simply unforgivable. He could imagine forgiving almost anyone for almost anything, he admitted. But for the man who took John from the world, he has never seen any reason to even try. Think about me, old friend. In one of the last interviews John ever gave, he spoke about Paul with real affection, joking about the two of them as brothers caught in a lifelong sibling rivalry. So much of what passed between them stayed private. But Linda McCartney once shared one last aching detail. According to her, the final words John ever said to Paul were a quiet request, to think about him every now and then. Old friend. Paul has carried those words with him ever since. In 1982, still raw with grief, he poured his heartbreak into a song called Here Today, writing it as an imaginary conversation with John, finally saying all the tender things the two of them, being who they were, could never quite manage to say to each other's faces. It became his way of keeping the conversation going, of answering at last the quiet request John had left him with. And even now, decades later, John has never really left him. Paul has admitted that when he writes, he still hears John's voice in his head. What would John think of this? He still catches himself asking. Sometimes, he says, he can feel John judging a lyric as too soft or too sentimental, and so he quietly goes back and changes it. The greatest songwriting partnership the world has ever known did not end with a lawsuit, and it did not end with a bullet. In Paul's heart, And in every song he still writes, it never truly ended at all. So now we want to hear from you. Did you realize just how deeply Paul and John had reconciled before the end? And do you think the two of them might one day have found their way back to making music together, if only there had been more time? Share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.